Hello, and welcome to Mending with Gold, the Kintsugi Therapist Collective podcast. Kintsugi Therapist Collective, or KTC, is a virtual community for therapists and aligned care workers dedicated to building embodied and liberatory practices of care. Each guest is invited to explore three aspects of Kintsugi as a metaphor for mending a place of brokenness in their life. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing pottery with lacquer and precious metals. By emphasizing rather than hiding what is broken, the whole experience of the object is honored. Infused with the ethos of KTC, Mending with Gold is a space to connect and explore the reality that there is strength, beauty, and value in the brokenness that is intrinsic to being human. For the care workers tuning in, we are currently enrolling the Spring 2025 Embodied Private Practice Cohort, our year-long mentorship offering for therapists and aligned care workers who are beginning or revisioning private practice with a focus on embodiment and sustainability. Follow the link in the show notes to learn more or visit us at www.kintsugitherapistcollective.com. Today we welcome Sarah Faith Gottesdiener to Mending with Gold. Sarah is an artist, facilitator, author, educator, and business owner of the Moon Studio. Through effective components of change work such as hypnosis, somatics, nervous system rewiring, creativity, archetypes, depth psychology, and energy work, her classes and courses shift perspectives and offer frameworks and practices for resourcing and self-understanding. Her book, The Moon Book, has sold over 30,000 copies and has been translated into over 4 languages. The Moon Studio is a producer of the cult classic Many Moons, an independently published spiritual guide, and Moonbeaming, an independently produced podcast that has been downloaded over 1.6 million times.
Sarah, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here. It's so good to see you.
I'm so happy. It's so nice to see you too.
Yeah. So welcome to the Mending with Gold podcast. This is our brand new project, and you are the inaugural guest, which is really cool. And I appreciate you being here.
I'm so excited. As you know, I love your projects, and I had the pleasure and honor of having you on my podcast, Moonbeaming. So I really just hope we can keep these conversations and exchanges and dialogues going. Yeah, we'll just flow down the river of the pod together. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, we start out with a kind of a big question, which is in the spirit of kind of thinking about Kintsugi, what is a break or a crack in your life that you might want to talk about today, and we'll kind of get into it.
Yes. So much arose when I was reflecting on this idea of breaks, challenges, wounds, and how they then, over time, if we are lucky, it's a mix, I think, of luck and skill and awareness and transformation. They can often also become our medicine. And when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking a lot about context as well, because I believe that so many of us might feel broken or have wounds because we were not given the appropriate context of who we were. We were not given the appropriate resources to help us grow into the oak tree from the acorn. I think it's this Platonian idea. It's some Greek philosopher that I can't remember the exact one. So there's this idea that we are born with all the information of who we are, who we need to be, all the qualities we possess, all our gifts, and that's like an acorn. And it grows naturally into a tree, but some of us weren't put in the right soil. Some of us were not given water, the right amount of sunlight. We cannot change what we do not understand. We cannot change what we don't know. And a lot of us, instead of being held with curiosity and a specific form of care, were made to feel like we were the problem. So if you're listening to this and you feel like you're broken, it's a very that's a very loaded word, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing wrong with you. It's that we're not given the keys or the maps or the insights into who we are. And then we're trying to navigate this much larger context, which is like the remnants of colonialism. We're also facing present moment colonialism. And I've been thinking a lot about this term I coined, the 3 S's of colonialism, and it's shame, separation, and scarcity. And that's what is created. And then it lives inside of us. And then maybe even unconsciously, we begin to act out in those ways or have those programs or those imprints kind of affecting us and influencing us. We might enact them on one another. We might unconsciously internalize these kinds of energies that really aren't ours. And so all of that is to say, for me, one of the largest wounds I had was simply not knowing that I was intuitive, like simply not knowing that I was queer, simply not knowing that I could create my life in a specific way based around certain needs, preferences, desires, dreams. And I just weren't given those tools. And I don't want to pathologize myself too much. I don't want to diagnose myself too much. But what I will say is, because I didn't know that, because I wasn't able to understand what those qualities needed, it manifested in shutdowns. It manifested in my early 20s. I was mildly to moderately like agoraphobic. Like going even to the grocery store was like too much.
Mm.
And it was because I was really sensitive and I didn't know all of the input I was taking in. And so, of course, I internalized it to that, like I was the problem. Other people can go to the grocery store, other people can go to a party and have fun. Why am I like, because I was feeling a lot, because I'm highly sensitive and highly sensitive people can have access to more sensations. And so what I ended up doing for a lot of my 20s really was either hiding or numbing with alcohol, or with like very intense sensations, which often sometimes can be what neurodivergent people do, is like high intensity, whether that be sports or BDSM or really intense relationships, or really intense projects, right? So when I started to understand what was going on, like thank the goddess, and I gave myself the space and the freedom to channel that energy in a different way through service, through art, through client sessions as an intuitive and a medium, through letting myself listen to trees. It's like by changing the dials and the modulations in my inputs, my outputs, my energetic fields, what I was doing, how I was expressing, alongside energetic hygiene and just like very simple practices, physiological practices, that changed into my medicine. And so I think a lot of our gifts get distorted and we can't recognize them as such because we're not given the right context. And I had to figure this all out the hard way. It took me well into my 30s to even understand what was going on, because so much of what was available to me has been so stigmatized and has been so, there's just a lot of stigma around being sensitive, being intuitive, having access to different realms, to different planes. There's just not a lot out there. There's a lot more now, but there wasn't when I was like 19 and trying to figure out why I couldn't go to the grocery store, even though I was fine. The other thing I want to say, just for folks listening, because I think for me, a lot of my healing, and this is why I do what I do with the podcast, and I know that this is why you do what you do, both professionally and with your podcast, is hearing people's stories and hearing certain specifics. So another way that would manifest is I would kind of have what I would call, so it's hard to believe now because I'm such a talker, but I would have selective mutism where I just like, and I learned that that is maybe part highly sensitive symptom, but also it's a trauma symptom of just like going blank, not knowing how to respond, not knowing what to do. Because if you grew up with caretakers that were incredibly erratic and you didn't know what was going to happen, I didn't know what I would say, if that would set something off. So like selective mutism was a strange way that would come in that I only learned later too, was like, I was like, why is this happening? Why in some contexts can I talk, people's ears off? But it's like there are these subtle activations sometimes that can happen in your and you may not even know, you might be unconscious to it. So that those were kind of some other symptoms as well. But again, when I gave this specific gift, this specific energy, the right vessels to flourish in and to grow, now I've taught, like over 300 people on a Zoom call before. Like I don't have that fear of the world. Now that the world is my friend, right? Now that I've made the world my friend. And I think that again, it's just important for folks to understand to not overcouple projections or diagnoses that might actually be our gifts not knowing how to manifest in more appropriate and more nurturing ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the more you're talking, I'm realizing that some of the questions, the sort of components of Kintsugi, the breaking and the lacquer and then the gold, you sort of, in a lot of ways, your work and how you approach your work is pretty emblematic of that, like that process. You really center in your work a kind of transparency about how your gifts that you now consider to be gifts and, are kind of what constitutes meaning in your life and is helpful for others, but is also deeply meaningful and special to you. And I guess you've spoken a little bit about this, but is there anyone or any kind of, is there in a person or a kind of setting you were in that, not like the singular person, but one person or a setting that maybe kind of shook you loose a little and helped you to kind of relate to yourself slightly differently? Does anything come to mind? Just
I always say I consider myself incredibly lucky to be exposed to a very specific queer and magical community in the Pacific Northwest at a very particular time. So where I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. And if anyone like knows, if anyone's like been to Hartford, I love Hartford. I'm not disparaging it. I'm just saying there wasn't the kind of culture that I had access to easily that was a accurate mirror. And certainly there wasn't a lot around me that lined up with my values, my ideals, things I enjoyed. And my intuition, like as soon as I graduated college, my intuition, I like packed up my Volvo and drove to the West Coast. I had no idea why. There was no reason. I knew almost nobody. Literally, I knew like two people on the entire West Coast. No one in my family lived on the West, nobody, right? So I just got there. I somehow knew. And that's the other thing. I think we all have these intuitive hits of like, I gotta go there, or like, no, not there. So I did that. And I was very, very, I consider myself so lucky to get to be around a lot of queer people, a lot of punk rock, countercultural people, but specifically queer, lesbian, trans, witches, and occultists. Very small amount, but enough that I was like, oh, okay, here's this whole other world. I got shown this whole other world that I wouldn't have had access to. So definitely community, absolutely being able to find folks who shared some of the same values or interests or gifts. I, again, to anyone listening, try to find those people, try to find folks that you admire who have like found a way to make it work, who have found a way to express themselves in some way. And again, like try to find places where you can express safely, because that's this other thing. A lot of us, for very good reason, don't feel safe to express certain aspects of our psyche or certain parts. And so I know that safety, like break, is like this loaded word, but what everyone now has that I didn't have access to is the internet and groups and Google and like, very specific niches. So if you're like super into vampires and glass blowing and you need to find that community and that's going to be healing for you, please like invest in that. So that's really like this, that was really this like pivotal time for me because I didn't have that before, and it opened a lot of doors. And I'm really grateful and thankful to some friends and the whole of the community there at that time, as well as sort of the subcultural art community, music community as well. That was like my first sense of feeling like, oh, I can belong here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like how you highlighted that you didn't know what you were looking for. You sort of left, and something about the modeling of that community or finding that community, it sounds like it you know pulled some of the pieces of you that were not really able to safely, manifest, sort of hold all of that together for you in a way. And you've become, you're a unique person, but that with that modeling, I think that we find safe enough environments where we can kind of make sense of our past experience, ideally, and kind of become a more integrated version of ourselves, if we're, like you said, if we're lucky and if we stumble on the right kind of environment. But it sounds also like you were not sure what you were looking for, but you were open, and you were that, I mean, I think that's part of it too. You had some kind of like kernel of belief that there was something else. You didn't know what it was, but you're like, there's
Well,
something.
what do survivors do better than hope? Like, what? There is nothing stronger than the faith and the hope of a survivor, because something has to be better.
Yep.
Like having a rock, for anyone listening, if you've had a rock bottom or, whatever that looks like for folks, if you've had a major fracture, we keep going because of hope, because we know that there's got to be something better or different, or, we just know that inherently. And I think that's a very powerful tool. We often don't know what we're looking for, but we often understand that we'll be able to feel it when we encounter it. And that's this other part, I think, too, and why I think the work you do is so important, and why I know you have part of your practice group work, because, and so do I, it's like the groups I hold space for are incredibly healing. There's so much attunement in vulnerability. There's so much co-regulating in the expression of an open heart, you know? And so that's really important too. So yeah, I just wanted to name that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe we could talk a little bit about what kind of what your life feels like on the inside now, because I think you were describing a kind of a confusion about your own internal experience when you were younger. You know, you weren't sure, nobody gave you language for it, you know, and you found this, you know, found community, you found yourself in a lot of ways. But I guess I'm wondering, you know, a lot got illuminated during the process of you, you know, finding community, finding parts of yourself that resonated for you. And yeah, I'm just curious about what it kind of maybe in contrast to how you felt at 19, right? You know, you're like afraid to go to the grocery store, but maybe not afraid, maybe just like a little
Overwhelmed,
overwhelmed. Yeah.
overwhelmed,
Yeah.
overwhelmed. Yeah.
Understandably. Yeah, because of your experience. But yeah, I don't know. Is there something you could say about that?
About,
About how it feels, like how you feel inside, you know? I mean, you
mhm,
mentioned some gratitude, you mentioned safety and
mhm,
um
yeah. I mean, I think what we're talking about is the attempt to, I guess in like psychology speak, it would be called like earned secure attachment
mhm,
with the self. And I know we've talked about this before in other contexts, but looking back, I think finding spirituality has been really important to me because it was like an undistorted place where I could begin to explore secure attachment. You know, so much of our trauma is relational, right? So I think finding a new place, a new avenue, a different avenue where there was no rupture, where there was no imprint, where, you know, where there was no past negative programming, you know, and that's something I also want to offer to someone listening is this beautiful Venn diagram of like what you're interested in, what you feel called towards, and where there hasn't been the specific flavor of relational rupture, trauma, abuse, whatever you want to call it. And like the roots of a tree, you know, have done absolutely nothing to me ever, you know, like worst case scenario, trip over them and like, you know, but there's no level. So I think finding that and understanding that I had access to energy and to support, as I've said, really anywhere, whether it's a house plant that I love and like talk to, or, you know, we're kind of animists, you know, I'm like an animist, right? Or a pet, or again, a park, or going out into nature, or the ocean, or the sun, especially with this embodiment piece, right? For me, talk therapy just isn't enough. There's a level of rewiring on a physiological level, certainly through the subconscious, as well as the nervous system and the body. And every time I have some kind of rupture, I'm in recovery for long COVID. So I had a very dark night of the soul recently as a result of that. I always do come back to the body and what does safety feel like in the body? And I know that you're probably familiar with his work. It blew my mind when I learned from Pete Walker and his CPTSD book about bracing and about like, tightness and contraction, because so much trapped trauma or trapped energy gets contraction, keeps it there. And so softening and opening and expanding and trying to stay soft is what has been really instrumental for me in order to find some kind of homeostasis with that. So I think that this embodiment of safety helps to grow capacity, which in turn makes the space for pleasure, awe, agency, connection, vulnerability, whatever that might be. And I really do think also that a lot of our, or I'll just speak for myself, a lot of my struggles came from this very cunning, very hidden dose of toxic shame that I think just hides out in our culture as like normal, which feeds into the contraction because it's often coupled with repression and, like guardedness, and that's all energetic, and that's all this physiological pattern that we get into. And there simultaneously cannot be like holding in and bracing and like openness. And you got to pick one, bud, like you got to pick a lane. You got to hang out there for long enough to normalize this softness. And then the last thing I'll say is from a spiritual perspective, I very much correlate this softness and this expansion that, is used in the psychology realm or the somatics realm with flow and surrender, is what we might say in the spiritual realm is like surrender and flow. And at the heart of that, at the base of that softness, that flow, that surrender is trust. And trust is really challenging for survivors. And the more we can locate self-trust, the more we can begin to bring in relational trust, the more I believe we'll come into a place of capacity, of security, and availability. We then get more availability to life, right? And sometimes it's that we got to be a little risky and we got to be at our edge. And then something happens that allows us to trust ourselves. Because again, I think there's this other rupture that often happens, which is the rupture of self-betrayal and self-abandonment. But I want to reiterate, like, so long as you're alive in your body, you're always there for you. You never left. You never did anything wrong against yourself. You were doing the best you could. You just know more now. Just more is illuminated, right? So when things are illuminated, you can get a different perspective. And hopefully we don't get caught in the shame and the self-blame and the guilt. Hopefully we can process that and we can continue to integrate and implement different ways of relating to the self and the world with each and every new illumination.
Yes, exactly. No, I really appreciate that. And it highlights something that I definitely want to speak to about in this podcast, which is, there are breaks and then there are processes of illumination and then there are breaks. And so as much as I'm so sorry to hear you're dealing with long COVID and so many people are, it sounds like, that is a crack, that is a break in some ways, a disappointment. I mean, I don't even want to describe what it feels like for you, but and so then we go through another process of kind of like pulling back together, and eventually certain things like you just described become illuminated in our lives. And maybe that process gets slightly easier over time, as you're describing, like as self-trust builds, and yet it's we don't ever get there. I don't need to tell you this, but we don't ever like get anywhere exactly. We're in a process, but I think part of what we're trying to highlight, I guess, in this podcast is thinking about the fact that it is important to pay attention to these moments where we can kind of assess or take stock of what has helped us and what gets illuminated in the process of kind of these really difficult times. I think so that we can build self-trust. I mean, in a way, that's part of it, is like, okay, this is what I learned from this, and I'm actually better off in a lot of ways, not because of the difficulty, but because of what I've kind of come to understand about myself.
Yeah,
And that's hard to remember when
1,000%.
you're deep in it. It's really hard to remember. Maybe we don't have to, remember
I
that when
think
we're deep in it.
I mean, I think it's why non-duality exists. Um, that I was certainly pushed into non-duality almost as a necessity in order to survive some of the things that I've survived. And there's so much there. Again, I think it's a cultural problem. I think that, and it could just be what I've been doing for the last decade or so, in terms of like my predominant work, similar to you being in a helping mental health profession. But I don't know. I just feel like I feel like the emperor's no clothes of it all is like everyone's got something, everyone's been through something. Most likely, everyone's been through something that makes you pause and be like, wow, whoa. And I think that this, I'm putting in quotes, hero's journey before and after, like main wellness, Disney, like 3-act story that you're either sick or you're well, and the very narrow definitions of each, where like sick being helpless and I mean, we could be here all day, very stigmatized. Well, being, I don't need anybody. I'm the hero. I'm the superhero. I have all the power. I'm not vulnerable anymore. Like this binaristic power over, again, colonialist project. I just think that life isn't like that. I just think that you can be going through simultaneously a beautiful, wonderful time and be dealing with something really effed up. Like it's just how it goes. And I think that for me, one of the biggest openers as well that I have to constantly remind myself, Asher, because I get so trapped in cognitive distortions of, when I'm better, then this, or if I'm, and it's just, and so I have to constantly remind myself that there is no, like you said, there's no like place to get to where we'll just be able to, like all of those funny utopic memes of like little mice living in mushroom houses, like we can try to cultivate that, but there's no final resting place until you're dead. And even then, I believe in reincarnation. So your ass needs to get back up and do it again after a certain point. Like, so pacing is great. We got to not just pace ourselves in this lifetime, but pace ourselves moving forward into the universe. I digress. So I think that, like, again, going back to your beautiful first prompt around a break, um, not pathologizing that and not coupling that with like, you're wrong, you're bad. Now I got to run and get over this. It's such hard work to do. I know that that's been one of my largest projects, is not to make, is not to connect different devastating things that have happened to me with me, and like I'm the problem. But
Yes.
once I understood that that wasn't true, and it certainly wasn't helpful, um, it just opened up so much. And in a lot of ways, it gave me back the love and the presence that I needed as a child. You know, we all, I think, need certain foundational beliefs as we're children. And one of mine was like, one of the things I needed to hear was like, there's nothing wrong with you. It's not your fault. You know, like that kind of thing. So I just wanted to offer that up. And that's also why I am always open to have vulnerable conversations about this, because I do think we heal relationally, and like hearing other people's stories, whether it's people that we look up to or just people who've been through something similar as we have, that alone is so useful, beneficial. And again, it gives us a context to be like, oh, wait, maybe I'm like this, or maybe it's this, you know, just it gives us some breadcrumbs like on the trail of our own processes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you for all your insights and for having these vulnerable conversations. I really appreciate it. You know that I value that as well. So, yeah, I really appreciate you. So, thank you for being a guest on our podcast.
Thank you so much, Asher. I had such a great time.